We have more for your ears only. I'm David Alpern.
I'm Catherine Herzog with this news quote. What McCoy has done is dangerous and reckless and put my family at a great deal of risk. That was James Everett Dutsky on the charge by Christy McCoy, attorney for Paul Kevin Curtis, that he had been framed for sending rice and poison letters to President Obama and a senator. Charges against Curtis were subsequently dropped, and investigators later arrested his longtime nemesis, Dutsky. Now this.
If government security forces enter towns, they will create sectarianism. We call upon the government to withdraw the army from the cities.
As Iraq marks 10 years since the U.S. invasion, it is descending to new levels of instability. On the same day as the Boston Marathon massacre, at least 79 people were killed and over 300 injured in a series of bombings and assaults across the country, including 26 car bombs and 16 IEDs. Last Monday, much of the Sunni Muslim minority held a day of civil disobedience to protest discrimination and violence by the U.S.-supported Shia-dominated government. Later in the week, Baghdad conceded the problem by announcing a commission to investigate the killing by soldiers of at least 20 civilian protesters at one location. But it also escalated the conflict, for the first time deploying armed helicopters against rebel forces.
Analysts feared further deterioration of security as Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki holds out against many Sunni demands and seeks survivable relations both with Washington and his aggressive Shia neighbors across the border in Iran. The roots of the problem are long-standing, but the current dynamic was fostered most dramatically by the now-ended U.S. military operation. What went wrong and why is the focus of a new book by a senior U.S. officer who was there. It is Breaking Iraq, the 10 Mistakes That Broke Iraq from the History Publishing Company. And for your ears only, co-author Ted Spain, a retired Army colonel who led military police operations for the war's first year, is on the line now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the opportunity.
Many people say we won the war but lost the peace. You talk about the problems you faced in trying to establish a working system of law and the police to support it, symbolized to a surprising degree by the hats supplied to Iraqi police post-invasion. Talk about that and the cultural blindness it represented.
Well, yes, ma'am. The ball caps is just an example of the cultural differences. One of the several mistakes that I personally made was not understanding beforehand what the cultural differences were. I tried to install a Western-style police in Iraq. That was a huge mistake on my part. And had to just deal with things like east side of the Tigris, west side of the Tigris. Believe it or not, when Saddam ruled, they were not allowed to cross the Tigris. Police versus patrol, which is something we do not have here in the United States. And, of course, things that was totally unacceptable that we're familiar with was a large amount of corruption and brutality from the Iraqi police.
On a more basic level, you saw the mission handicapped by the lighter is better theory of war developed by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Talk about the inadequacies of men and equipment.
Yes, sir. He was in the process. I'd studied at the War College a couple of years before that. He was in the process of transforming the military, just as you said, that lighter is better. And basically, we invaded Iraq on the cheap. We didn't have enough soldiers. You may recall General Shinseki said we needed about 500,000 military not to win the war, but to, as you said, win the peace. And that was based on the Kosovo and the Bosnia model. But we went in with about 108. Went in about a third of the soldiers that we needed. And believe it or not, we thought we were going to be in there for a year and stand up a new government and leave. And you saw how that worked out, much like President Clinton said when we went into Bosnia to stay a year, and we're still in Bosnia.
Another civilian you saw fostering failure was L. Paul Bremer, first head of the Coalition Provisional Authority. What do you see as his major mistakes?
Well, the two major failures now Bremer says in his book it was Secretary Rumsfeld. Secretary Rumsfeld said in his book it was Ambassador Bremer. I don't know who made the decision, but he disbanded the Army. So they took their weapons home, went home, and came back to fight us later. But what really had a huge impact on me is he stripped out the highest level of the Ba'ath Party, and that's where my most senior Iraqi police generals were. And as the generals told me, that they didn't have a choice. They were forced to be members of the Ba'ath Party. And that absolutely killed me, and I lost all the senior folks that I was dealing with, and we started over from scratch.
On the military side, you say Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez was over his head as top commander from June 2003 to July 2004. What were his major failings?
Well, you just said it. He was over his head. He had been. He was a good example of the Peter principle. He was promoted above his abilities. And I talk a lot in Breaking Iraq about a leadership, and you really have to have leadership is the critical part to make up for failures. No military plan survives the first contact with the enemy, and it's just like a quarterback on a football team. Quarterback looks at the defense, he's got to call an audible at the line, and you got to have leaders in combat doing the same thing, and Sanchez couldn't do it.
In a previous segment on this week's show, we discussed the Bush administration orders for so-called enhanced interrogation that an independent, nonpartisan panel of experts this month concluded was torture that did not produce significant useful intelligence. How did you see the detention and interrogation process then and now?
Well, I have a chapter in the book talking exactly about that, and I can only speak for what I was involved in, and once again, you set the standard. We were struggling with, I was told by my operational lawyer, I had an operational expert assigned to me. He was advising me that some of my detainees were not subject to the Geneva Hague Conventions. My position was, and I made it very clear across the brigade, that we would treat all detainees, regardless of their background, we treated them the way we wanted to be treated, and we wouldn't have an issue.
What's your reaction to the escalating violence in Iraq today?
Well, my personal opinion is, all wars are political. So the president has different elements of power available for him. But when the president, regardless, it doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat, when they make a decision to use military power, they need to let the military take over. Decision was made to invade Iraq, and we have certainly cut and run in Iraq, in my humble opinion. You see what has happened in the 15 months we've been out of there. We're about to do the same thing in Afghanistan.
Retired Army Colonel Ted Spain and former FBI official Terry Turchi wrote Breaking Iraq from the History Publishing Company. Now head of security forces at an Energy Department nuclear site, he'll be at a Pentagon-sponsored workshop this week on post-conflict governance.
Quote from the news, it's like discussing the future of shipbuilding from the deck of the Titanic. That was Roberto Quercia, director of the Center for Community Capital at UNC Chapel Hill, on the argument by banks that they must charge a 20% down payment for new mortgages, despite evidence that this supposed protection against default is actually undermining a housing revival.
Next, when it can't speak, autism writes. For your ears only.